A celebration steeped in emancipation, the words of a Civil War president that brought freedom to slaves in states the Union had been fighting. On this Juneteenth, the holiday that is certainly not new is garnering renewed interest. In the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, states, cities, companies are making it an official paid holiday. But against this modern backdrop of protests and calls for justice, what can Juneteenth teach us? Dr. Carey Latimore, a professor of history at Trinity University, joins us for a discussion of Juneteenth and lessons we can learn. I'm Steve Spriester. Welcome, first of all, to all the Trinity Tigers that are watching, but also to all of you at home who are watching on KSAT.com. Thank you for joining us. We are pleased to be joined by Dr. Carey Latimore, a history professor from Trinity University. Doctor, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
All right, right off the top, what is Juneteenth?
I think when we think about Juneteenth, we think about two things. One is the historic day of Juneteenth, which is really June 19th, 1865, which is a day that General Gordon Granger entered Galveston, and he issued an order that basically said that all slaves in Texas were free. And so that's the historic day. And then Juneteenth from then became a day that African Americans celebrated as kind of I would say a second Independence Day or a second Emancipation Day. And we can certainly talk about that later on.
So explain the Emancipation Proclamation. Obviously was put out there before June 19th. So
right.
Why did it take so long for it to get to Texas and for all of the slaves to find out that they were free?
Well, several reasons. One, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued for the southern states, the states that were in a rebellion against the United States. And so, of course, since the Confederate States of America were in rebellion against the United States, they did not feel any reason to uphold the Emancipation Proclamation. And another thing that's interesting about that is that the Emancipation Proclamation is a very political document. For the first 2 years of the war, President Lincoln is trying to kind of not play up the role that slavery played in the war, even though the war is about slavery. He understands it's about slavery, but he's not mentioning that as much. But for a variety of reasons, slavery is coming into the equation. One, African Americans are pushing the envelope. They're asking to be part of the armed services, free African Americans. They are, when the military is taking over areas such as Fort Monroe, in Fortress Monroe in Virginia, slaves are going there and saying, take me in. They're basically asking, free us. And then Congress is questioning passing laws such as the First and Second Confiscation Acts that are dealing in some way with slavery. And so Lincoln is pushed, but Lincoln has these border states that he is trying to appease because these border states still have slavery, perhaps limited, but they still have it. And he's not trying to piss off really some of the more moderates within his party. And then on the other end, Lincoln is kind of a moderate himself. He's not theoretically an abolitionist, he's anti-slavery. And so when he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, it doesn't cover those border states. It only covers, and it doesn't cover areas that are under the control of the Union Army. It only covers states or areas that as of January 1st, 1863, are in current rebellion against the United States. And so Texas being in current rebellion against the United States, it takes until the end of the war for it to reach Texas. And so therefore you have 2 years after the end of the war.
Okay, because there's
2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, sorry.
Because there are also some, there's some myths out there that maybe you can clear up, that that the person that was supposed to deliver this message to states like Texas was killed in the process of getting to Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Are any of these myths that we hear around Juneteenth and why it took so long from the Emancipation Proclamation to get word to Texas, are any of those myths reality?
I don't place a lot of emphasis on those myths. I mean, one, we now live in a very immediate historical time, and so we want our information immediately. There was no Twitter back then. There was no Facebook. There was no Instagram, no Snapchat. And so time takes it, but really it's the ending of the war. So let's just take June 19th. If we move back to April 9th, that's when General Robert E. Lee surrenders his forces, the Army of Northern Virginia, at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Then a couple weeks later, General Joseph Johnston surrenders his forces, the Army of Tennessee. So that's 2 weeks later. And then most of the companies start to, they surrender. Many people are deserting. But you have this one group, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi. This is an army that really handles states like Texas. It was kind of west of the Mississippi. And so these states, these areas, and specifically Texas, are under still kind of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi. They refuse to surrender. And so they're still fighting the war. And so the last battles of the Civil War really happened in Texas, the Battle of Palmito Ranch in mid-May. And so the Army of the Trans-Mississippi finally surrenders in late May. And so then we have this process by which the Union Army is now kind of cleared to move into, and so then they enter into Galveston. And one of the things that we should also note is that on that day, June 19th, every slave in Texas did not hear about that. So June 19th wasn't the last day that slavery existed in Texas, and it wasn't the last day that slavery existed in the United States.
Right. Is Juneteenth, did it start as, for lack of a better word, a Texas thing? Because, the origins in Galveston and things like that.
Yes, it did. And, what happened in Galveston, and Granger's decree was given at several different locations in Galveston. One was an African-American church. One was their military, where they were held up, military offices. And so it was given several different times. And then outside of Galveston, the word spread. And so I think that that's kind of where we get the whole, you have a date, it's spreading. And then in subsequent years, slaves celebrated that day, June 19th, and it became kind of something bigger. They celebrated that day as an Emancipation Day.
So it kind of started in Texas.
It spread from Texas.
Yeah,
yes.
So it started in Texas and spread. And how has it evolved over time?
I think the spreading of it, and one of the things that we should want to understand is the role of slavery in Texas. Texas had slavery, but during the Civil War, because Texas was so remote, masters are bringing their slaves into Texas to escape the wrath and a sense of the war, but perhaps also, one might argue, to escape the Emancipation Proclamation. And so they're ending up in Texas. And so the number of slaves in Texas increases tremendously. But as that number is increasing, those slaves are part of a longer process of mobility. And so if you think about the last 40 years of the antebellum period towards the Civil War, there's a tremendous domestic slave trade that's bringing slaves from states like Virginia and Maryland through Tennessee down to the Gulf South, as cotton and other things are really growing down in this region. And so slaves are being increasingly split off from their families, and then for many of them, finally into Texas during the Civil War. Maybe some of those slaves who were brought into Texas during that Civil War era perhaps left after the Civil War to find their family members in other states. And so the close proximity also of the other states, former slaves, free people now are moving into those states. And so they're carrying with them the memories of Emancipation Day. And in a sense, when you think about it, it's something to hold on to. Just imagine you're told one day you're free. They probably heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, but they may have thought that it would never happen for them. And so it's something to hold on to. It's a symbol of hope. It's a symbol of optimism. And so in subsequent years, they celebrate it. So in 1866, 67, they do it. They get together, they celebrate, they enjoy themselves, but it's also a time of coming back together. Many of the people who lived on these plantations, they would have been family members. And so coming back together, they would have shared those experiences. They probably would have shared their hopes and dreams. And then over time, they shared those things with their children. And indeed, Juneteenth was so important to them that some of them even purchased land so that they could hold Juneteenth celebrations, like Comanche Crossing, which I think is now Booker T. Washington Park in Limestone County, to hold these celebrations. So it was very important for them, and those things have continued. The attendance has gone up and down, it's crescendoed and decrescendoed over time, depending on kind of where we are as a society. I think right now it's a high period, even though we're sheltering in place theoretically. But over time, it goes up the interest of Juneteenth. This is a very popular time for Juneteenth, but there were other times in which it was just as popular. And so I think sometimes the times kind of demand how we see Juneteenth as a holiday, in a sense, or as a day to remember.
Yeah, you may just answered the next question, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on it, is why Juneteenth has become such a popular holiday for African Americans. And, you know, like you said off the top, it's a second Independence Day. A lot of people consider it that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's popular right now because of the times that we're living in. And these are extraordinarily difficult times. It's a time where the nation is trying to grasp its history and its legacy with race. And race is it's our nation's, one could argue, it's our nation's greatest fault. It's been there for so long, and it's has been difficult for our nation to come to terms with. And right now we're having a moment in which we are asking as a nation very difficult questions that kind of get at the essence of really who we are. And Juneteenth is part of that. I think that if we peel this apart, and if you read, and I'm going to read for a quick second what Granger read. The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, which is the Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are free. He continues, this involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. And it continues, the freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere. It's hinted here that, and maybe not even hinted, that they're going to stay where they are, that they're going to work where they are. And so that freedom doesn't really sound like complete freedom in the way that we might think about it. And so that's kind of the American story, in a sense, a nation of great promise and principles, but often not living up to those great promises and principles in regards to race. And I think that that's the link that we have, that these slaves who became free people, once they heard this on June 19th, 1865, entered a difficult world on June 20th, 1865, a world that was not welcoming to them, a world that did not provide them in Texas with any civil rights at that point in time, and a world in which many people wanted to keep them as close to slavery as possible, but they were free. And so the question about the meaning of that freedom, I think, is a question that we're still asking. And I think as we look now, what is that meaning of freedom when we look at a George Floyd or Breonna Taylor? Or we look at, even when I think about my own life, when I was growing up, I didn't think that I would live to be 30 years of age. I thought that I would probably be murdered in some way, shape, or form. Or we look at the incarceration rates or the wealth gap. These are questions I think that America is starting to ask. And it's not just Black Americans, but all Americans, and wondering if this is the kind of society that we want. But to understand, I think we have to get back to kind of a foundation of that. And I think Juneteenth is an opportunity to explore that. Because if these former slaves are free, then why did they not enjoy the same rights and privileges? Consequently, we come back to 2020, we can ask the same question. Is this the America that we want? So I think that's the larger question. Are we where we want to be? And if not, how do we get there? Those are the same questions that the freed people were asking at that point in time, even though they were happy, they were excited, they were optimistic. I would hope that we feel the same way today.
And that's something that bringing up that decree and what was read, I mean, clearly they're in a better position than they were. They're going to get paid, but they're not free. They're not truly free if you read that by the words that are in there. And is that, I mean, adding that context though, don't we, and I'm just going to speak from my personal experience. Obviously, I'm a white man from the Midwest. When we talk about these things, we see the Emancipation Proclamation in our history books, and we think, okay, that solved slavery. Then we see the integration of a school in Little Rock. Okay, that solved desegregation. You know, we see all these things in history books as these milestones, but really, we're not there yet. Does that make sense?
Yes. I mean, we have milestones, but we also have the nuance within the milestone. And so in the same way that the Declaration of Independence says all men, and I would argue all human beings, are created equal, endowed by their creator, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. It's written by a slave owner. But yet these great principles, and how do we deal with that contradiction? And I think America has always dealt with that tricky contradiction of freedom versus slavery, freedom versus non-slave. And so in a sense, we have always struggled over how to identify ourselves and what we want to be. And I think that when we look at freedom, freedom is tricky. It's also tough to define what that means. And so once emancipation comes, the South and areas that had slavery are now going to struggle over what that freedom will be and what the terms of it. In other words, did emancipation mean the right for African Americans to not be a slave or to not be enslaved? Or does it mean citizenship? And that's the struggle that happens over the entire Reconstruction period, and indeed throughout the Jim Crow era, and then throughout the Civil Rights era. And so we see with the milestones that we have, the laws passed, but we also see the struggle that have happened in between those times of the laws being passed. And so in a sense, we may change laws, but I think the harder struggle for America is to change hearts, to change minds, to change attitudes. And that has been, I think, the struggle over time.
Yeah, would you agree with the premise that, I mean, this was a country started as a great experiment, right? Democracy. And that, you know, in certain cases, it's a trial and error, and that experiment is ongoing even today as we speak.
And I think that we have a hard time dealing with that kind of nuance. When we're teaching classes, we want it to be very clear. So Lincoln freed the slaves in 1863, but we still were fighting a war in 1865. Or then there's a 13th Amendment passed. I think we want it to be clear, and history tells us that things are mucky, in a sense, dirty, hard, a struggle. And we often don't have the desire to really examine it throughout that entire struggle. And I think that that's the opportunity that we have today at this moment, is to examine the struggle. We have the time, I think, now, for a variety of reasons, COVID being one of them. And I think that because of a lot of these things coming in at the same time, America is starting to ask questions in a way that, as a historian, I haven't seen us ask those questions broadly in that kind of way ever during my life.
That's interesting. All right. So currently Juneteenth recognizes a state holiday in the state of Texas. I believe the state of Texas was the first state to recognize it as a state holiday.
I think in 1980 or something like that.
Yeah, there's a push to make it a national holiday. Your opinion on that?
I don't disagree. I think that if you really, I think it is a day that people are celebrating, and it's a day that was created by those free people. And I think that's the important thing about it. This was something that they treasured, that they saw. And because of that, I think it's all of ours. It's a holiday for all of us, in a sense. It is a big deal to be told that you are free. It's something that they anticipated, that they wanted, that they desired. And even if it was an imperfect freedom, it was something, and it's something that they wanted, and something that they grasped, and something that think of the significance that they're still doing it 150 years later, that we're still celebrating. I think it's a great opportunity for our nation to ask those difficult questions of itself.
And I want to clarify something. When you say this is a holiday for all of us, you're not talking just African Americans. You're
No,
talking
I'm
about
not. No,
you're
everybody.
talking about Americans. I mean, this is a truly American holiday.
It is, because America is not just a story of presidents and chief justices and the wealthy. America is all of our stories. And unless if all of those stories are really told, we don't really gain an understanding of who we are as Americans. And so this is America's story. America gained wealth through this institution. I believe it gained its identity in a sense through this institution. How do we understand freedom if we don't understand the reverse? One can think of the people who are our founders as they grapple with slavery themselves and they deal with constructing a nation. One has to think that in their minds, they're dealing with slavery and they're dealing with inequity. And so it is our story. It's not just our African American story. I'm an African American, but in that piece of being African American, the African American identity is all identities in a sense. And so whatever we have and whoever we are is America. And so I think that that's a symbol there too, that this really shouldn't just be a day that only African Americans look at and celebrate. It should be a day that all of us celebrate, because when one becomes free, we all become a little more free.
Obviously, you're a professor of history, so you're very familiar with Juneteenth. Does it have a special meaning today, where we are as a country, where we are as people?
I think it does. And I've thought about this for a long time. My introduction to some of the issues that we're dealing with today was through Rodney King. I was a teenager then, a young teenager. And so I remember seeing that gravelly video, and I knew what that meant, and it bothered me. It hurt. I remember Amadou Diallo, and I came up through, as I was older, I saw Trayvon Martin and those things, and, what's happening now. And in a way, something is different now, because I think America is now saying that this isn't the African Americans' problem, that this is our problem. And I think that that's different. I don't know if there was that feeling after Rodney King that this is our problem as a nation. I think we're getting to a point of where we're asking that difficult question. And so if you ask, is it different now? I think it is, because it's a day that African Americans treasured and celebrated. And I think even at that time, they were questioning what that freedom meant. And I think as we come back to that, that's what we're asking at Juneteenth. Is this just a day to celebrate and say we're free when you have these inequities, you have these biases? I, as an African American man, my life expectancy is going to be a lot less than you, Steve. I plan to make sure that I'm going to do everything I can to live as long as I can, but I recognize those things, and it carries a burden with it. And so I think it's important now because there is an opportunity. There's an opportunity for America to become that more perfect union. And if we seize this opportunity, the people of goodwill, and make the decisions that can make us better, then I think that this day will have even more meaning as we move forward. And I think that that's what people are seizing on. It's not just a day. I think it's a moment, it's a movement, it's an opportunity. And I hope and I pray that we harness that into something positive and make constructive changes to better the lives of all.
And I think we learned so much by just listening to each other and listening to each other's stories. And my daughter rides horses, and they had a great sign at her horseback riding lesson that said, "Observe with your eyes, not with your mouth." And so that kind of is where, in this whole thing, I think we can learn from each other. So The final question that I have for you is people who are watching this live stream now or later, because it's going to be on both Trinity's website and KSAT's website. What's the one thing that you want people to take from this conversation that we've had today?
Hope. And the reason why I say hope is that maybe it goes back to who I am. Maybe it's part of my own faith beliefs, but it's also my understanding of my ancestors many of them were slaves, and hearing their emancipation stories. No matter what they went through, they had hope. And no matter how difficult the times, they still had hope. And so they looked to these moments for inspiration and hopes. And so my mother and father, when they were growing up in the segregated South, and they were born in 39 and 34, they grew up in segregated Virginia. They thought about what happened before, and they looked at what their ancestors went through and how they came through that, in a sense, through the wilderness into something different. And they had hope. And I think here, even with all of nihilism and the fear, the thoughts of what's going on now with COVID and everything else, I think there is an opportunity of hope. When I see young people, older people, Republicans, Democrats, Blacks, whites, Asians, Latinos, when I see them all saying, this is our thing that we have to deal with, I have hope. And that we can make the reforms, that we can make changes. And I think this is a time, ironically, even through COVID and others, I think it still is a time of hope. And I would hope that Juneteenth would lead us to kind of re-examine that even though the slaves, the free people weren't fully free, they had hope. And for me, that's what I take from it. They still had hope. They were optimistic. They were positive. They looked to the future. They didn't give up. They didn't quit. They kept pressing forward. And I think that's the message for all of us, hope.
Dr. Carey Latimore from Trinity University, I really enjoyed our conversation. And since I didn't say it earlier, happy Juneteenth.
Thank you.
And for all of you who are at home or in classrooms or in the library watching this, thank you very much for spending your time with us. I'm Spriester from KSAT 12. Have a great rest of your afternoon.